Hello everyone, this week's video is about the business cycle. So what the business cycle is it's a diagram and it represents the short-term fluctuations of economic activity over time. Now, annoyingly, there are two types that we look at here. We look at one where looks at the changes in real GDP over time, so how that tracks as it goes up, it goes down. And there's another business cycle which looks at the changes in real GDP growth over time. So whether it's growing or whether it's how fast it's growing, how slow it's growing, etc. We do have a bunch of definitions that we need to know. There are quite a few, but I trust that we're all going to be okay with them. So expansion. This occurs anytime there is an increasing real GDP. So if the real GDP of the country is growing, there's economic growth, then that is an expansion. A boom is a type of expansion. So a boom is the economy is growing, but it's when unemployment is actually also below the natural rate of unemployment. So we're operating at an equilibrium past LRAS. So we're going to have unemployment below that natural rate of 4.5%. We've got a recovery. This is another type of expansion. So it's increasing real GDP, but when the economy is in an output gap, which means output is less than potential. So we'd be calling that in class a recessionary gap. If the economy is in that and it's growing, it's called a recovery. A downturn. The economy is still growing, but it's growing at a slower rate. So it's similar to that idea of disinflation. So the economy still growing, it's still positive growth, but it might have gone down from 4% down to 3%, down to 2%, still growing, but we still call that a downturn. A contraction. This is when the economy is actually not growing. So all these above, the economy is growing, but this one, the economy experiences negative economic growth. So it actually shrinks, it contracts. Then a recession. We do have a technical definition for this one, which is when there's negative growth for 2 quarters or 6 months or more. That's how it's generally used in economics. A peak, like I said, we've got the two different models, so they show slightly different things. If we're looking at the real GDP growth business cycle, the peak is the highest rate of growth, right? And then if we're just looking at GDP, it's the peak will be any point before growth is negative. It's kind of easier to see this on the diagram, so we'll look at them very shortly, but we'll need to have all these in our notes. And the trough is the opposite of a peak, right? So on the real GDP growth diagram, it's the lowest rate of growth. And on the real GDP business cycle, it's the lowest point of GDP. So it's going to be the part just before growth goes positive, right? Okay, here's one version of the business cycle. So we've got real GDP on the y-axis and we've got time on the x-axis. So here's our business cycle. It's this blue line. It shows how GDP is growing. And look, GDP goes down. So that means it's a contraction, right? GDP is shrinking until this point, starts growing. Right. There's also this big line through here, potential output. That's how much the economy can produce if it's using all its resources in a sustainable way. That's essentially the LRAS, right? It's how much the economy can produce when it's operating at full employment or at the natural rate of unemployment. So 4.5% unemployment, we consider that the highest or the lowest sustainable rate of unemployment before inflation gets too high. You might remember that. Hopefully you remember that. And we expect in any economy that the potential keeps on growing over time. Right? We have more resources, we get more productive over time. So we expect that it's got this upward trajectory here. It's like a trend for how much GDP we can have. Now I'll add a bit more detail here. There's, like I said, 4.5% unemployment, which is potential output. Now, this doesn't have to be shown on every diagram, right? This detail, but I'm showing it here to help us understand the diagram. So here, this is the area where the economic growth is increasing. So it's an expansion or a recovery. Expansion, recovery, here where it's increasing. So what's it going to be in the middle? That's not the next animation, whatever. We'll come back to that. So here we are, the boom. This will match your definition that you have in your notes, because the boom is the economy is growing and we're below 4.5% unemployment. Now on this diagram, it's above, but that means GDP is well past what we would expect our potential to be, which generally means unemployment is below 4.5%. So that's where we have our boom. The peak is just before, it's the peak of GDP before it starts to actually fall. So there it is, its highest possible moment. And where GDP is falling, that's a contraction. The economy is shrinking between this time and this time. Remember, we've got time on the x-axis here. We've got our trough. This is our lowest point of GDP before it starts growing again. So things to remember here. We've got our boom. We've got growing GDP and unemployment under 4.5%. If we have growing GDP and unemployment above 4.5%, so here, that's going to be called, they're both expansions, but more correctly, it's called a recovery, because we're in an output gap. We're less than potential. We're growing. We call it a recovery. And you can't see that on your screen, I don't think. But falling GDP is going to be a contraction. All right, let's head on to our next slide. So this is what the boom is going to look like on our ADAS model, right? We're beyond full employment. This is where our economy is. So it's a boom. We keep on growing. We've got what we would call a booming economy. We're in a boom. We've got growing GDP. We can see real GDP is growing, and unemployment is less than 4.5% because we're well beyond the LRAS. That's a boom for us. Okay, this could also be a boom, growing GDP and unemployment under 4.5%. So still a boom. Even though it's not AD that's increasing, we can have a boom due to SRAS. That's probably a better way to have a boom, because doesn't come with the high inflation, but still a boom. Here's our other business cycle diagram. So I want to spend a bit of time here. This has real GDP growth. So here above this line, we've got positive growth. Below the line, we've got negative growth. Now, I know that's a weird term that we use in economics, but under here is when the economy is shrinking, right? So anytime growth is positive, it's an expansion or a recovery. Like, we know that from before, that's still the same. This takes people a little bit to get their head around, but the peak in output will actually be here, because it's growing. It's growing at a slower rate, but it's growing until here where it goes negative. So this is where the peak would have been in the other model, right? So the bit that looked like that in the other model is here, actually, because it's just before the economy starts shrinking. So under there, where it's negative, that's obviously a contraction. And again, the trough in actual real GDP is here, because that's the lowest point, because it's shrinking until this point. So it's going to be the lowest point, and then it starts growing again. So the peak in growth, this is the highest growth rate. It's the highest growth rate. A downturn, we've got growth, but it's falling growth, right? So that counts as a downturn from our definitions before. And this is going to be our trough in growth. So it's the biggest negative there, right? The lowest growth, biggest negative, however you want to phrase that. So if GDP is growing at a faster rate than previously, that's an expansion or a recovery. If it's growing at a slower rate than previously, that's a downturn, isn't it? And if the GDP is growing negatively, that's a contraction. And if it grows negatively for more than 6 months, it's a recession. So there's a lot of definitions in here, I'm afraid, but that's how it is. Some final things to know. The business cycle is not regular or predictable, and also expansions usually last longer than contractions. All right, so what we're going to be learning in class is we're going to be looking at how we can tell the part of a business cycle from some economic data, what phase of the business cycle it is in, and how we can show that phase of the business cycle on an ADAS diagram as well. Okay, so make sure you've taken good notes, and we'll work through some activities in class to really get our heads around it. Thank you.